in Husserl, where we get the question of theoria, it's especially sustained in the context of the psychologism question, where psychologism is understood to say psychology is more fundamental than is logic. We get the vision of the problem of logic in Husserl motivated by Husserl's thinking that what the Greeks called episteme, the lower part of the higher part of the divided line, shadows. But when there's a shadow, that's the lowest part of the lower part of the divided line. When there are shadows, one assumes the shadow comes from something that's reliably present, such as hemoglobin. The scientific hypothetical name for what in the vernacular the language tells us is blood. Or according to two Russian linguists, the Iker, which is apparently a Hittite word. The Iker, according to some passages of the Iliad, is what's in the place of blood for the gods, the theoi. Better put, we should say, the Greek word for blood, what's in the place of the Greek word for blood, for the theoi is the Iker, and it so turns out that Iker is a Hittite word, because on this theory, because the early archaic Greeks, let's say, or whatever comes before the archaic, the Greeks we know are the classical period, mainly, past the 6th century. We're talking about Bronze Age or earlier. If we're talking about some kind of other time scale that could be more like Mycenaean age, prior to the age when the private property became more powerful, and the rule of mafias became more prominent. Because before that, either things were too rural for it to matter, or they were hyper Egyptian style, more like Egyptian style, total lockstep of the higher beliefs and the practice of things, so that there's no room to make the binary of power and resistance. It never occurred to me. Or if it did, only in a pre-conceptual way, so that it couldn't be driven at in a direct sense. Episteme in Husserl takes this form of notion of theoria becomes the contemplation, or in English, about the year 1600 or so, the word theoretical meant contemplation, contemplative, so that the word theory, so that when we do mathematics proper, colleague and friend of Strauss, Jacob Klein, has written a book about this, the difference between counting numbers and episteme numbers, mathematics proper, which the way I explain it to myself is the unit, the mathematical unit, which is symbolized in geometric terms as the square, this complete enclosed unit, this perfect unit. That's only in theory or theoria or the onlooking or contemplation or the theoretical in this full sense. But then what it evolves to mean is these things that were only available in this mode, in thinking of, for instance, whole numbers. Each whole number is absolutely equal to each other whole number and can be represented as a square or another. We could, in fact, do all kinds of abstractions. Any enclosed geometric area we could understand, and we could put the number 1 on to this one unit. In this realm, with this type of stuff is possible. We get episteme, and there we get these strict equivalencies and strict groupings of general concepts. Multiplication is a general concept. It's actually anything you could express as multiplication, you could express as addition. These things are take their structure for theory in Husserl's version. But now there's a different sort of sense of what theory means, which is theory can be hypotheses that are meant to be clarifying or explanatory in preparation for experiments, which would then try to make predictions. Hypotheses in the sense of trying to make clarify how to make good predictions about things. So there's already Husserl has taken one side in this sense of what theory is about, and then he tries to demonstrate that it's independent of any psychology, and he appeals to Lotz's understanding of this Geltung or validity theory. Geltung or validity theory seems to meld into the problem of distinguishing things, distinguishing one thing from another as a whole, so that it seems to have the sense of happening in this contemplation rather than in practice, so that it's this vexed attempt to split two worlds, contemplation and practice, is always attacking us, and it's still attacking us in Husserl, is what Heidegger's saying. So I believe that's something of why Heidegger says Husserl One whose role was himself fell into this psychologism, which he was trying to break away from. Because the notion of the validity that he takes over is a notion it's a notion which is inseparable from saying somebody. It's a notion that's inseparable from the same difficulty we're getting with the question of, do judges vote or do they judge? The validity is like, it's presented as a special carve-out. Oh, now they look at the proposition, they look at a sentence, and they say, oh yes, this makes sense. I judge this to make sense. And then you ask, isn't that coming from them, from their psyche? There becomes a difficulty where we don't know what comes from the psyche, or what. For instance, if we hear a poem, a Robert Frost poem, "This is my promise to keep," and we say there's something poetic about that, and then how do we decide if it's actually in the logos, or mythos, or poesis, if it's in the statement that the poetic lies, or if it's in us. So this is the same problem as treated also by John Stuart Mill, and it becomes controversial in the first half of the 19th century. It sort of sets the tone, and all the Germans respond to it, but repudiate it. Was that the way John Stuart Mill tries to set up logic, but then trying to set up the foundations and argue the foundations of logic becomes everywhere in the universities controversial. John Stuart Mill had said the law of contradiction is just as much a law of our psychology as it is of logic. So he says they're both, he does a kind of Kantian thing and says, oh, they're both superimposed and they're both true. Sort of like both theses have proven themselves, because one, what I mean by a contradiction is the same in contemplation as it is when somebody comes to me and says something that sounds contradictory in a forensic sense. They tell us about the past, and we say, well, didn't you say something else before that? Isn't that a contradiction? It happens in the same place, according to John Stuart Mill, and therefore the logic and psychology overlap. I think this is a prolonged problem to maintain this thesis, and it breaks apart, and then you get further and further apart, because Kant still thinks everything can be handled perspectively, which is to say, yes, you have the perspective of basic physics and you have the perspective of history. They're different, but omniscience sees all of them at once. Those are the extremes, but in between would be the personal psychology, biology, chemistry, and you could make different gradations, right? All these type of questions seem to, you could look at it this way perhaps, like in the 19th century, all the major universities don't know what to do with these type of questions. It's like smoke rising from a landscape. It's like the different forms you see, and clouds when you're daydreaming. All kinds of things become possible, and one doesn't know how to moor this. And at the same time, the notion of theory as the hypothesis, which has to do with clarifying or explaining to ourselves something for the sake of making a prediction, starts to become very attractive, because it's because the practice of technology becomes more important, and acceleration becomes more of a thing. I mean, I'd like to say Ludditeism is the opposite of accelerationism. That's a sort of a orientation, so that it's not so much simply oriented by Enlightenment contemplation, but to say it that way is in a way just to go to a historical example, historical, supposedly empirical example, which then again remains caught in this sort of Kantian precepts, concepts, juxtaposition. For Kant, both the precepts, or the things of the senses, and the concepts, or the generalizations of contemplation, are true, but the precepts without the concepts lack their intelligibility. So that's the way Kant constructs intelligibility, which in Heidegger, I think what I object to most in the main treatment of Heidegger is the constant use of the ambivalent and confusing word meaning. I prefer intelligibility, in the sense that this is the basic thing of Dasein. But Heidegger himself says what anyone wants to understand by intelligibility is it's an open thing. It's not, this is part of what's under question.